The night was cold. The light of 10,000 stars shot out their fiery chill from light years away, surrounded only by the mindless darkness of pure nothing. Stephen, having experienced continual trauma and danger from those stars, had no longer paid them much mind. They'd become threatening eyes to him, their diamond-esque appearance filling his mouth with a vacuous dry sensation, which gave way to an unpleasant taste. They were like the eyes of a large predator, lurking from some dark concealment nearby. He shut himself in from such eyes, shielding them with the blinds on his window in his new downtown apartment. He'd had to work at a local restaurant for a barely livable wage just to survive. However, in his spare time, he refined and improved his musical talents. He already had considerable experience and skill with many musical instruments, as well as singing, and had decided to pursue that for the time being. He did performances over live streams and managed his YouTube channel when he could. He'd struggled to gain a decent following on there, but he would notice a few comments from his Beach City friends and family. He and Connie had tried to stay in contact as much as they could, but lately messages had begun drying up, and her visits via line had become less consistent. It had been weeks since he'd heard from her at that point. It's her that he thought about as he began writing his next song. It was called Pieces of Home, and told of a young soldier living in a hellish environment, clinging to a letter from his significant other, the last letter that he had received in a year. Unfortunately, the song explains that the letter catches on fire, and the embers and ashes of the letter are the only pieces of home that the soldier has left. To say that Stephen often felt sad or depressed would be an overstatement. While there was a lingering aura of somberness around him, he would not have described himself as sad or depressed. He was often in a neutral state of being, like a ball at the top of an arch. It could easily roll one way or the other, but for the moment it remains comfortably stationary in the center. Yet there were moments when he reflected on this state of being and wondered if this, too, was a bad sign. Perhaps he should be happier, or sadder. Perhaps he was losing the ability to feel anything. These moments were brief and quickly forgotten, however, simply quick thoughts that burst through his mind from time to time. Once he had finished writing the song and ensuring it sounded good, he decided that was enough for the night. He checked the time and saw it was 11:39. He should have been asleep over an hour ago. As guilty as he felt about this, he simply shrugged it off and decided to go to bed then and there. His tiredness the next day would indeed be regrettable and unfortunate, but he had spent the time this evening doing what he so greatly enjoyed, and so ultimately that time was worth it. He closed all of the windows on his computer and shut it down for the night, before going to the bathroom to get ready for bed. He checked his phone in the meantime, perusing social media posts he found interesting or amusing, as well as news reports. The article concerning statewide blackouts a few borders over concerned him a bit, however, and it was then he decided to stop reading and go to bed. For a few minutes he listened to calming music to put himself at ease, before comfortably drifting off to sleep. "Stephen," said a distant voice. Stephen shot up in bed, looking around the room to see who might have said that. It sounded feminine, yet it wasn't a singular voice, he deducted. It sounded more like a crowd of feminine voices, all whispering his name in perfect unison. Shaken, he checked the time. 4:50 in the morning. He would have to go to work in a few hours. Maybe 4.5 hours of sleep would be enough? It certainly didn't feel like it. He lied back down, having concluded that he was alone. The voices must have been part of his dream. As he thought this, though, he became fixated on the peculiar lack of a dream at all. He couldn't remember anything from it, if there was anything to remember. Just darkness. As disconcerting as this was, he could recall similar sleep experiences in his past, however infrequent. That voice was certainly something that clung to his memory, however, persisting in his head like an echo that never seemed to fully dissolve. Rolling over to make himself more comfortable, Stephen tried once more to get some rest. After work, Stephen thought it would be a good idea to check in with the Gems. They hadn't directly interacted in over a year, and he hadn't been able to make local friends very easily. None of his co-workers seemed very open to friendships, and aside from other tenants and his landlord, he didn't really see very many people in his daily commute. As he was walking to his car, he shot Garnet a text message that read as follows. "Hey Garnet, hope you're doing well. It'd be nice to talk to a familiar voice. Would you be free to call anytime soon? Love you." Stephen put his phone back in his pocket, ensuring it was on sound and not vibrate, and entered his car. A few minutes into driving, he felt his phone notify him of a text. He smirked a bit, happy to get a response, and would check it once he got home. But then his phone went off again, then again. Several times his phone buzzed and pinged. Although he was primarily confused, there was a growing sense of fear in him. At a stoplight, he thought it would be good just to glance at it for a few moments, just to see what the hubbub was. When he opened his phone, he saw that he was continually receiving messages from Pearl, Amethyst, Garnet, Peridot, and various other gems and unknown numbers. They all said the same thing. "Stephen, come home. Stephen, come home. Stephen, come home." Paralyzed with fear, Stephen took a few extra moments before he could process the honking of cars behind him. The light had been green for several seconds. Snapping back to reality, he stepped on the gas and forgot to turn. He would have to take the next left and circle around. The notifications finally stopped once he pulled up outside of his apartment complex. Getting out of his car, he didn't even bother looking at his phone, instead switching it to vibrate in case they started up again. Walking up the numerous levels of stairs to his floor, Stephen heard it again. The voices from last night, only they were louder this time. His heart pounded in his chest, and there was a deep soreness in his stomach. He felt nauseous and ill, and a dizziness began to spread up through him. He took a moment to stop, breathe, and recenter himself. It was okay. Inhale. Clearly something was going on, but he's dealt with stuff before. He's stronger now, and he is in control. Exhale. Everything will be okay. Feeling less nauseous and dizzy, he continued up the stairs until he reached his floor, entering his apartment soon after. Once in there, he leaned his back against the door for a bit and sat down in front of it. He knew something was going on, but what? He supposed there was only one way to find out. He had to come home. After a little less than a day of driving, Beach City was in sight. The town had an eeriness that disturbed every fiber of his being, however. The lighthouse was the only source of light from the entire city, and he was only able to make out the other buildings and structures because of the milky light from the moon in the lighthouse. The lighthouse's luminescence was much more pure than he had remembered. Much more white. As he drove through the streets of Beach City, he saw things such as broken windows and figures within houses and buildings that he was unable to discern, for it was too dark, and his motion made it difficult to focus on their form. Something was very, very wrong here. As he pulled onto the beach, he saw that there was an otherworldly pale glow from inside the beach house, one that couldn't be produced by any artificial light source. He got out of his car, the chill of the night air wafting over him from the sea. A chill that persisted through his skin and made movements increasingly difficult. Every part of him was telling him to turn back, as though the beach house itself was repelling him, but he had to know. He'd come this far, and there was no going back from here. Walking up the steps of the house, he looked inside and saw that the warp pad was the source of the glow, and that Garnet, Pearl, and Amethyst were all motionlessly standing in front of it, staring at it. He tried to peer around and see if his father was there. He saw blood splatters in the hallway leading to the bathroom, and his heart sank. Every part of him felt heavy and numb at that moment. As fixated as his gaze was on the blood, it quickly darted back to the gems, who remained as they were, motionless. He wished that this was all some terrible nightmare that could just be shut off and forgotten once he awoke. That's certainly what it felt like. But the only terror that can match the most dreadful of nightmares is the realization that the nightmare is, in fact, reality. His foot felt as though it had increased in weight by 10,000 pounds, but he pushed through and entered the house, his heart racing in his stomach. He wanted to speak, but knew not what to say, nor if he even had the ability to speak at all. His legs felt simultaneously heavy and weak, shaking as he moved forward. His morbid curiosity compelled him to look at the source of the blood, but he consciously tried to fight against it. He didn't want to see something he knew he would regret. Ultimately, it was his curiosity that was the victor, and he was subjected to that horrible, gruesome fate which had befallen his father. He had hoped he would be able to revive him, just as he had done for Lars, but there wasn't much left to revive. Combating the urge to vomit, he swiftly focused once more on the gems, his vision clouded by oncoming tears. He tried to push out words, but they came out as hoarse and whispery, making him clear his throat before repeating the effort. "What happened?" Stephen asked, his voice quivering uncontrollably. The gems did not react, not even a twitch to acknowledge his voice. They could have been statues. Then the voice broke through once more, only it spoke something different this time. "Come home. Come home." After this, the warp pad glowed even more brightly, beckoning him. He should have left then, he thought. He should have just turned around, bolted out the door, and drove back home. But that wouldn't have changed anything. It would have simply left this festering trauma and mystery in his mind as it slowly rotted away his sanity. He had to press on. He had to know. Moving past the gems, he stepped onto the warp pad, turning to face them. Their faces were not disfigured or manipulated in any way, as he had half expected. Instead, they were just blank, emotionless. Their eyes stared off into nothing and did not respond at all to the surrounding visual stimuli. Somehow, Stephen found this lifeless display on their face to be even more upsetting than if their faces were horrific and corrupted. This view was swept away from him as the warp pad transported him to a dreaded place he had never wished to return to. Homeworld. He was in a part of Homeworld that he didn't recognize, but saw all of the gem life which had occupied it were just as motionless as the gems back home. The same dead expressions were displayed. It wasn't even that they were frozen in time, caught in positions of whatever activities they had participated in before they were frozen. They all stood upright, their arms at their sides like soldiers receiving orders from an unseen commander. Stephen no longer felt as though it was him moving forward with this. His mind felt separated from his body, as though he were simply watching himself. It didn't feel real. "Stephen," echoed a soft yet booming female voice, clearly very distant. It was a familiar voice. He began moving towards the source of the sound, his ears ringing because of the deafening silence that blanketed the planet. He tried once more to control his breathing, steadying his heartbeat the smallest amount, before he began running through the winding and twisting paths of the planet. "Stephen." Again, the voice cooed. He knew the voice, but couldn't identify it very easily. He would intermittently take breaks to catch his breath before continuing to sprint again. The voice would call out again and again, only increasing his determination to find it and get to the bottom of all this. Before long, he came upon the mouth of a tunnel at the bottom of the city, which made him pause. He had never seen this before. The voice reverberated from within, and so he continued running towards it. Ancient structures and scribbles, clearly gem language, coated the walls and ceilings of the tunnel. He decided to slow his pace a bit, shifting from a run to more of a jog. The majority of his fear had been removed for him. In its place stood determination and anger, compelling him to press on. The further down he went, the more the tunnels seemed to twist and swirl, becoming strange and unnatural in their formation. It took him a good 30 minutes before he reached the bottom. The ethereal glow from the lighthouse was once more present in this room. It was a massive hall, the size of several city blocks, adorned with arches and pillars, but, most importantly, the glistening crystal statues of figures, all various shapes and sizes. Shapes that were perverted by the extrusions of veins or branch-like formations from their midsections, all with different colored tints. There must have been hundreds, and they all stood on the floor on which he stepped. They were made of what appeared to be diamond, the glowing white light from the opposite wall turning to rainbows through their forms. Yet they all conveyed the same emotion. They were all seemingly frozen in moments of pure terror and panic, with some facing the way that Stephen had come through, having desperately tried to escape. The source of the light was too bright for Stephen to comfortably perceive. He couldn't discern its shape or its true size, but it seemed to be emanating from a point about as high as his head. It was here that the fear returned, solidified when the voice from before spoke out, yet again. "Hello, Starlight," said the voice from his mind, which he now recognized as belonging to White Diamond. "I'm so glad you made it here." "What do you want with me?" Stephen asked, attempting to hide his growing fear. "Oh, nothing, my dear. Not anymore." The light source began to branch out across the wall, and he recognized that it began to carve out the outline of White Diamond's form. "You see, I am so very old, my dear, and I get so very bored. I first created Gemkind, as you know, but they were merely puppets, extensions of me. I controlled their every word and every action. While it was fun for the first few millennia, I grew so tired of it all. I needed something new, something I couldn't control quite the same. And so I turned to other beings on planets beyond my own, and eventually to the human race. To your father." Upon this revelation, Stephen's heart shattered inside him. It felt as though every organ within him had become frozen and petrified with horror. "The gems?" Stephen asked, unable to hide his swarm of fear and despair. "Such pretty puppets, aren't they? I had such fun watching you grow, of playing the parts of your family and your enemies, watching you laugh and cry and grow. You were truly one of my favorites, and I have humanity in part to thank for that. If it wasn't for them, I would never have been able to create hybrids such as yourself, ones that I can't control, but I can track and watch and follow no matter what. You were such fun to watch, Stephen." Stephen looked around at the figures surrounding him. He understood then, but the next words filled every part of him with an overwhelming surge of fright. "But not anymore." He unshielded his eyes, instinctively squinting at the brightness before seeing what White Diamond truly looked like. His brain was no longer able to process emotion in that moment. Barely any thoughts filled his head. "It's unfortunate. Yet at some point the fun must end. But look on the bright side, Starlight. I can always make another one. Her real eyes stared at him from within some inconceivable insult to reality, a form which was unlike any organism Stephen could ever have comprehended. Not the wildest of human minds could have imagined her appearance. Tendrils of her light slithered out, wrapping around him, wrapping inside him, the quintessence of reality filling his veins with a fluid that was the pure embodiment of light. She is in the emissions of stars and galaxies, of nebulae and novae. She is the light that flows throughout the cosmos, burning his skin like a fire made of ice. Her voice is so warm that it melts his eyes into raindrops that disintegrate into space dust, accumulating particles and energy as they rocket through space into planets for her to play with. She is the voice which rings out in the silence of space, filling the void with the absence of her nothingness. All presence of consciousness is but a terrible blag to her existence, and so she watches it decay like the corpse of an insect. In his final moments, the being once known as Steven Universe screamed his thoughts through his mouth and eyes, shooting his life out in a magnificent display of light and blood. Blood that burned to the touch of air and became shards of bright pink crystals. His gemstone burst out from his midsection, ripping his organs and veins out with a mind-numbing display of bright, shining pink. As the room darkened, one would notice a new figure made of what could have been described as diamond, among the hundreds of others. This figure, like the others, seemed to have crystal branches growing from its midsection, with just a slight tint of pink to them. Its pose conveyed an extreme amount of terror that no human has the capacity to experience in their lifetime. And it is in this pose that the figure shall remain for the rest of eternity. As a man leaves his job at a restaurant, he spots an unusually tall woman in a white dress with pink hair flowing and swirling from her head. They make eye contact, and she gives him a curious and endearing smile.